From Rio's Earth Summit in 1992 to Rio Plus 20, and new hurdles on the path to fair and sustainable global development. Today, 1.5 billion more people are using and abusing the environment. Governments are reeling from the global economic crisis, and the gap between rich and poor is getting wider. If we continue our wasteful ways, by 2050, almost 4 billion people will live in areas experiencing severe water stress. The world, largely China and India, will need 80% more energy, most of it based on fossil fuels. Greenhouse gas emissions will remain stable in OECD countries and Russia, more than double in the rapidly growing BRICS, and rise in the rest of the world, increasing globally over 50%, pushing the Earth's temperatures up 3 to 6 degrees Celsius by the end of the century. Farming, sprawling cities, logging, and climate change could reduce biodiversity and mature forests by another 10%. Air pollution, particulates, ground-level ozone, and unhealthy indoor air will be the top environmental cause of early deaths worldwide, with the rate tripling to 3.6 million per year. In other words, current growth patterns are not sustainable. There's only one way forward: going green to boost global economic growth. Pricing natural resources and making pollution more costly are key to solving economic, social, and environmental concerns. For governments, carbon taxes and auction permits could raise $250 billion per year by 2020. And removing subsidies to fossil fuel production and use would reduce emissions and free up funds to improve education and healthcare. Aid from donor countries, more than $5 billion every year for environmental protection, with technology transfer, trade, and investment, and more financial support can give all countries a fair chance to grow green. For private businesses, green investments can improve the balance sheets and the environment. At Rio Plus 20, governments must make good on their promise of greener, more sustainable, equitable growth.
We want an economy, we want a society, we want an environment which will make sure that the future generations will have this planet to enjoy.
I'm only a child, yet I know we are all in this together and should act as one single world towards one single goal.
There is enough for everybody's need, but not for anybody's greed.
We are facing something profoundly important. We have never faced this before.
The term green economy itself suggests an emphasis on the dual ecological and economic dimensions of a solution. But the definition provided, I think, particularly by UNEP, is one that does explicitly incorporate social goals. To quote, "A green economy is one that results in improved human well-being and social equity, while significantly reducing environmental risks and ecological scarcities, based upon a combination of low-carbon growth, resource efficiency, and social inclusivity. So in a broad interpretation, this may approximate the notion of sustainable development.
The two key convictions I can identify in the Green Economy project are, first, that there is a triple crisis, depending on one's perspective. The first is a socio-political crisis, the second is an economic crisis, the third is a broader ecological crisis. Second key conviction is that the ecological crisis can in fact be harnessed to solve all three of them. And this is the central point. The ecological crisis isn't necessarily solved in the project, but it is used as a driver to drive a new round of economic growth.
And it's a crisis of. It's not one of those that we can simply manage in the old way, but is a fundamental challenge to our ways of thinking about crises, of crisis management.
We would argue that the green economy paradigm is very much within the sort of crisis in the system framework, whereas the global justice thinking is looking at this as a crisis of the system. So it's a much more overarching systemic critique.
So when we debate on this whole question of what is the green economy, what would it look like?
It's being narrated at present as capitalism's best hope to create jobs, restore growth, and limit climate change, a magic formula or magic bullet.
Its strengths clearly lie in the fact that it is one of the very few projects currently that has a coherent, but not necessarily correct, proposal for addressing all three parts of the triple crisis. Its second strength lies in the fact that it has a strategy to create a social base for its own project.
So good thing about the ecological modernization is that they acknowledge that the current crisis, or the crisis, environmental crisis of the century, were the result of the industrialization and modernization. But when it comes to solution, they think that technological and procedural innovations will solve the problem. So in other words, they try to solve the contradiction between economy and ecology within the capitalist mode of production.
But it also, precisely because it's a floating signifier, because of its productive fuzziness, it creates the possibilities of false alliances, misreadings, of takeovers, of colonization, and so forth. It has a certain incoherence, and it's vulnerable to capture by the most powerful economic and political forces.
Among the concerns about a green economy are inevitably questions about equity, justice, and the link with development. Will a green economy transition centre on technological fixes and business as usual, or will it conversely be seized as an opportunity to enhance well-being and transform the social structures, institutions, and power relations that underpin various forms of vulnerability and inequality?
Its weaknesses are threefold. First, it clearly represents the danger of the emergence of a new green Washington consensus articulated by the North, used to impose policies on the global South and close off space for other alternatives. Second problem is that it doesn't and can't address the problem of growth, the problem of infinite growth on a finite planet, because it focuses on the extremely distant possibility of decoupling economic growth from environmental destruction.
And then there is, of course, the whole question of distribution. We know that there are poor countries and rich countries. Of course, it's not a dichotomy, but there are also poor people within both rich and poor countries.
If those in the North want to preserve what they have, it's minus growth for the South, or being paid off, bought off.
And we have the terrible experience of the structural adjustment programs during the 1980s and 1990s, and the impacts were quite terrible, and we're still paying for that in terms of human capital.
I think it's also very important to demystify this vicious, sort of perverse circle that says, well, climate change affects the poor, but the poor need to grow, need to develop, therefore we need more growth, therefore we need to continue business as usual.
How to construct hope is one of the major issues if you want to bring social dimension to economy.
There are questions and choices here and challenges for production, for consumption, for distribution, and finally, of course, for transformation.
And this new transformation we are suggesting must be different from prior structural transformations associated with the development process, all of which were highly carbon intensive.
Technological fixes for politico-economic and socio-ecological crises are undemocratic and unsustainable.
How to leapfrog this development, to use a bit of the usual term, how can they skip the same path of development that richer countries in the north did, which are very carbon intensive or chemical intensive and so on.
Who has power from the current status quo? Who benefits from the position now? Who profits from that, if you want to look at the economics of it? And who has the power to make those changes? And so the concept of power must be central to all of the analysis that we do as we look forward.
We find that gender equality is very strongly associated with good performance in environmental terms, and that this is true even if you just take high growth countries and you look within that subset. We still find that the strongest environmental performance tends to be from the countries with greatest gender equality.
The real changes here, I think, are mostly institutional. Building regulations, a discussion of norms and values around what it means to be a global citizen today.
If we're talking of a situation right now that is unsustainable, and that's why we want to change it.
Science has given us a problem that science has no solution. That the solution lies in seeing it from a human perspective, seeing it from a social science perspective.
The big window of opportunity is for people to mobilize, because now it's time to change.
Isang donasyon mula sa iba-ibang probinsya at ibang bansa para sa mga napinsala po ng bagyo. Maging ibang biktima nakitulong na rin po sa relief operations ng Sagip Kapamilya. Nagpapatrol Nina Corpus.
Dagsa ang mga volunteer sa ABS-CBN Sagip Kapamilya dahil walang pasok, karamihan sa kanila mga estudyante. Damang-dama ang bayanihan, bata, matanda, sundalo, madre, lahat nagkakaisa para tumulong.
Wala naman akong money to help, so at least ako, yung sarili ko nila i-volunteer ko.
Walang tigil ang trabaho dito sa Sagip Kapamilya pero tila walang napapagod. Dito walang maliit o malaking trabaho, mula sa pagbuhat o pag-repack ng mga relief goods hanggang sa pagtali ng mga sako. Lahat sila gustong-gustong tumulong, kahit na ang iba sa kanila ay hindi pa nga kumakain. Si Aling Ana, kahit lumubog ang bahay sa Angono Rizal, nandito para mag-volunteer.
Wala na po ako uwi, wala na po ako titirahan. Kahit na po ako nabaha, yung naghirap, lahat sinubok ko sa buhay ko. Gusto ko rin po makatulong sa kapwa ko.
Kasabay ng pagbuhos ng mga donasyon, ang pagdagsa ng daang-daang volunteer sa Sagip Kapamilya sa mga regional office ng ABS-CBN. Sa Bicol, mismong mga dating biktima ng Bagyong Reming ang nag-volunteer sa Sagip Kapamilya Relief Operations sa ABS-CBN Legazpi. Mahigit 100 naman ang nag-volunteer sa Davao. Sa Cebu, walang tigil ang repacking ng relief goods sa ABS-CBN Cebu Complex. Gayon din sa ABS-CBN Cagayan de Oro. Umabot na sa halos 2 milyong piso ang perang naipon ng ABS-CBN Regional Network Group. Mahigit 30 milyong piso naman ang nalikom ng sagip kapamilya sa Quezon City. Nasa 70 million pesos naman ang donasyon nila in kind. Malayo man sila, nagkaisa pa rin ang mga OFW para magpaabot ng tulong sa mga binagyo. Isang fundraising ang pinaplano ng mga OFW sa United Kingdom matapos mapanood sa TFC ang pinsala ng bagyong Ondoy. Sa California naman, nag-donate ang mga batang Filipino-American ng sarili nilang ipon para makatulong sa mga kababayang nasalanta ng bagyo. Niña Corpus, Patrol ng Pilipino.
At ang latest naman po sa isinasagawang pagtulong ng ating mga kapamilya stars sa mga nasalanta ng bagyong Ondoy mula sa ating Star Patroller, Femela Baranda. Fem.
Karen, tuloy-tuloy ang pagsuporta ng mga kapamilya stars sa Sagip Kapamilya Caravan. Pansamantalang nagpaligayan nila ang mga biktima ng bagyo nang bumisita sila at mamahagi ng tulong sa San Mateo, Rizal. Nagpapatrol, Mari Dumawal.
Kumislap ang mga bituin sa latest relief operation ngayon ng ABS-CBN Sagip Kapamilya. Nagsama-sama sa unang pagkakataon, sina Ay de las Alas, Rufa Gutierrez, Chris Aquino at Bea Alonzo para mamahagi ng tulong sa San Mateo, Rizal. Bukod sa pagkain, namahagi sila ng tsinelas, sabon, cellphone charger at iba pang gamit.
We want them to know na nandito kami, nagmamahal sa kanila, and we care for them.
Lahat tayo nandito dahil utang natin ang kung ano man ang meron tayo bilang mga kapamilya galing sa mga sumusuporta sa atin.
Ano ba naman yung isang araw na ibibigay namin, konting biyaya.
Ganun talaga ang tao, pag bless, kailangan mo i-share your blessing.
Mahigit 10,000 pamilya ang nasalanta ng delubyo ni Ondoy dito sa barangay Banabasan, Mateo, Rizal. Matatagalan pa bago sila makabalik sa normal na takbo ng buhay. Pero sa ngayon, konsolasyon sa kanila na makasama ang paborito nilang mga bituin. Sentro na atensyon ng love team sa sina Shaina Magdayaw, John Prats at Sam Milby Ann Curtis.
To give back para tulungan ang mga kababayan ko.
Give all you can give, diba? Napaka-blessed tayo na may bahay tayong inuuwian.
May power tayo, na blessed tayo na meron nun. Na pag nakita kanila, na-uplift yung spirit nila.
Tumulong din sina Marica Reyes, Iya Villania, Angel Aquino sa caravan na inorganisa ni Chris. Ayaw naman pansinin ni Chris ang mga sigaw ng evacuees. Hindi raw dapat ihalo ang politika dito.
Dapat yung tulong is not based on anong mangyayari sa May, di ba? Dapat yung tulong is based on now. Importante talaga iparamdam natin na nakikiisa tayo sa pinagdadaanan nila.
Hinikayat din nila ang ibang bituin na makisama sa mga relief effort. Mario Dumawal, Patrol ng Pilipino.
I think the best way to put it is that the Philippines is getting there. In the sense that, yes, there are a lot of problems, and while we do have a lot of laws concerning the environment, that at least is a start. And because we do have a lot of laws and we do have an active media and civil society, so increasingly we are able to get government and business to become more accountable. Okay. Even just having this discussion taking place in the media, take for example the situation of SM and the trees in Baguio. We actually don't know, because they have not seen an article that conclusively says what happened that night, where people from Greenpeace say that these trees were being cut, but you'll notice from their accounts they did not actually see the trees because the place was fenced in. And on that same night, SM claims that it was balling these trees. Balling is acceptable, not the best, but in terms of balancing the need to develop site. Of course, there are broader issues with SM. But the point is that here we are having a very active discussion on what should take place in that particular problem. And that discussion was not something that could have been taken maybe even just 10 years or 20 years ago. Okay? And the discussion is at a level that SM is forced to act. And we can see it that SM is trying to become greener in different ways. It doesn't want to address directly that issue, but it's trying. Okay? Just because it feels that its interests as a company might be damaged because of that. So, the nice thing about having a lot of laws is that there are clear, there is a clear basis that you can always go back on. Okay. And while it is true that a lot of the laws are still violated, but now because of media, the internet, and civil society groups, they're able to pool their power and bring big violators and hold them accountable. Okay. But one of the challenges actually in the Philippines is that what we see to be the big problems or the big causes of environmental damage, it might not even be these big corporations, but it might be the sum total of a lot of small things. Like a person who cannot find a job in the city ends up going into the mountains, clearing a small space in the mountains to have a small farm. Okay? And you might have several 100,000 or several million people doing that, and so you have deforestation happening, not because of mining or logging, but because people are hungry and they're trying to feed themselves. So we really have to approach environmental problems from a more holistic point of view, a more developmental point of view. We cannot separate our concern from the environment from our concern for people and their well-being. Because you cannot expect a person to value a tree or an animal if he's hungry. But if we are able to address the basic needs of people and to address those needs in a way that address those needs in a way that use resources efficiently and effectively, then these more destructive practices can be controlled. It really depends how you want to look at it. Okay. One way of looking at it is that our state or our government is so weak that we rely on other people. Right? We have to call family and friends if we need help instead of calling the police or the fire, the Bureau of Fire Protection. But on the other hand, is there anything wrong with that? If you look at it, yes, from the standpoint, purely from a state-oriented point of view, yes, it's bad. But who says that the state has to control all these things for society? So, I think that on one way it is bad because it does indicate that it is one symptom of a problem in which our political system is very personal rather than impersonal. Right? We relate to one another as people, even our political leaders as people, rather than to the office or to the institution which they represent. Right? But on the other hand, who says that everything has to be done by government, or who says that all these things have to be impersonal? And as far as I'm concerned, if there are particular problems in a society or any problems that a community or a person has to deal with, what is important is the problem gets solved, right, in a way that respects people's rights, entitlements, and privileges. Okay? And so if people rely on other people to help satisfy their needs rather than government, well, what's important is that after a disaster, people survive. Whether that need, or rather that service provided by a family or a friend or government, personally is immaterial. Okay? What's important is that people survive. And whereas other countries have problems using civil society or NGO organizations to check the powers of government, here in our country we have a lot of civil society organizations, we have a lot of NGOs filling in the need that government is unable to provide. As far as I'm concerned, as long as the need is addressed, then I think society is better off than that need not being addressed at all. There is a weakness only in the sense that if you look at it from the perspective that a theoretical modern state is supposed to be doing these things for the people, then yes, it is. But then that's just one way of looking at this political social dynamic. I think society is richer for the fact that people rely on other people, rely on social capital rather than political capital in solving these problems. And I think that's something that can be studied, understood, and appreciated more. And maybe we can even develop some way of building on this. Okay? In fact, I think, in far-flung areas in which government has very little presence, you can imagine, for example, of barangays where to get to the barangay center, to get to the main town, you have to walk for 5-6 hours or maybe even a day. So, and that's just a factor of the geography of our country. It's very difficult to reach communities because we have a difficult geography. And you cannot have a representative of a state in every single corner of the country. So if people are able to solve their problems by themselves or through organizations, then I think that perhaps is even a good indicator of how people are able to look after their own rights and look after their own interests and to gather together in a very democratic fashion to preserve those rights and interests. So if you look at it from a state point of view, yes, it might be a problem. But if you look at it in a rights point of view, in the sense that people are being proactive in exercising, maintaining, and protecting their rights in the face of a disaster or some other challenge, then I think that's better.